to meet with Zhou Enlai. And then we will also welcome Dr. Kissinger to come to prepare for the meeting. And he said this message, he had with their great sense of humor and their subtlety, it ended with an interesting clause. He says, this message is somewhat different from the usual diplomatic message because it's from a head, to a head, through a head. From a head of state or government, Zhou Enlai. Through a head, of course, was Yahya, Pakistan, to a head. The message, of course, since we had no relations with China, didn't come from the Chinese. The Pakistani ambassador had delivered it to Henry Kissinger and then Kissinger to me. So it was from a head, through a head, to a head.
Did you celebrate?
Oh yes, that was one of those occasions that I thought it was important to. I usually have nothing to drink, particularly in those years when we had such intensive schedules after dinner. But somebody had given me that year a bottle of Courvoisier brandy. It was supposed to be, several 20, 30 years old. And so I went down to the hall, opened the brandy, and put a little in the snifter for Henry and for me, and we both tipped our glasses to what we thought was a rather historic meeting.
How much was the opening to China, the initiative to China, Henry Kissinger's policy, and how much was it Richard Nixon's policy?
It was both. We came to the conclusion independently, however. After all, I had never discussed the China initiative with Henry Kissinger. He was not my advisor. He was Nelson Rockefeller's in the 1960s and the 1967. And but he went along with it and agreed with me with the conclusion that I had reached. There was no question that he independently had arrived at the same conclusion. But if he had not had a president who wanted to move in that direction, there was no way it could have been accomplished, and he, of course, has been the first to acknowledge that.
If you had not had a Henry Kissinger, could it have been accomplished?
Yes. Not as, I don't think as effectively as well. Henry was a master at intrigue. He went to Paris 12 times without being discovered, and he was able to get into China there and be there 3 days without having it get out. But I must say that, and he handled the negotiation with Zhou Enlai brilliantly. On the other hand, I had made the determination before I appointed Henry Kissinger as my chief advisor in the foreign policy field. I had made the determination to move in that direction, and I would have implemented it another way.
With the presidential election coming up at the end of 1972, were you unaware of the fact that this announcement of the opening to China was going to be an enormous political coup for you?
Well, many thought it would be, but it really wasn't. That's again, people in the media writing with their hearts rather than their heads, because it gained us some and lost us some, but perhaps overall it was a wash. As a matter of fact, I remember so well that Henry and I disagreed on this, not just as a matter of appraisal, but he said, you know, you're going to go way up in the polls when the China announcement is made. Bob Haldeman thought so too. I said, I'm not so sure of that. I said, it's going to cost us some too, and it did. The polls didn't move up at all after the July 15 announcement, and curiously enough, even after the dramatic visit to Peking in 1972, the polls did not go up. And the reason was that those who favored the initiatives, for the most part, were liberals who were against me politically, and would frankly been just as happy if somebody else had done it. Those who opposed the initiative were conservatives. They were disillusioned. Those who favored it and those who opposed it both did so for mistaken reasons. I mean by that, those who favored the initiative felt that, well, finally this old red-baiter Nixon has learned that the Chinese are not all that bad. In other words, in effect, he's got a little soft on Chinese communism. Those who opposed the initiative, those that were pro-Taiwan and so forth, thought that I had deserted them. Also because they thought, well, I had gotten soft on the Chinese communists and so forth. And they were both wrong on that score. It had nothing to do with my attitude toward communism. I was still against it, as I had always been. It had to do with my analysis of the long-term interests of the United States and of our current problems in terms of our competition with, in other ways, with the Soviet Union.
Before you went to China, Andre Malraux came to the White House and talked to you about what you would find. What do you remember from his visit?
I had met Malraux for the first time when I went to Paris in 1969, and he was one of de Gaulle's great supporters, more liberal than de Gaulle, but admired de Gaulle as a great man, as I did. And I noted then that he had had a stroke. Well, it was a stroke which had left him paralyzed on one side. It was very difficult for him to talk, but I had read some of his books. He's a brilliant writer. And I gave a dinner for him and saw him before dinner at some length. And even with his, it was just painful to watch him talk, you know, with his mouth drooping down like that. But the words came out in a torrent as he described China. I asked him, what are they like? Because he knew Mao and he knew Zhou Enlai and the rest. And he says, Mao has a vision. He is possessed by a vision. The man is a sorcerer. And he went on as to what Mao was like. And then finally, after he had described him, he said, it's worth the trip.
Did he talk about the problem of the aging of the Chinese leadership?
Well, that was his conclusion with regard to Mao. He said Mao is a colossus, but he's a colossus facing death. And as he looks at you, he will think how young you are. And I thought that was interesting because at that time I was 59. In other words, what is interesting to me is that you would expect Malraux to say, well, as you looked at me, here's the representative of the great United States, here's the anti-communist, here's the capitalist, etc. But no, he said, as he looks at you, what he will think about how young you are, because he is a colossus, but a colossus facing death.
Did you feel that that unlike a lot of people, he had a sense of the adventure of what you were doing?
Yes. Let us understand that the decision to go to China was a difficult one for us. Difficult for me because I knew Taiwan. I had great respect for Chiang Kai-shek, for Madame Chiang Kai-shek. I knew of the Taiwan miracle. It's a miracle like Japan, what they have done there. Taiwan today, for example, with 17 million people, exports more than the People's Republic of China with 1 billion people. That's an indication of what an economic success it was.
How did you break the news to Chiang Kai-shek?
It was broken through diplomatic channels.
Should you not have done that personally, given your
No,
ties with him? And
it wasn't. It would not have been the appropriate thing to do. We had to do it. We had to treat them all the same, and so
surely that was a special relationship, though.
But in each case, we felt that it was important not to treat one different from the others. We had to think of them. We had to think of the Japanese, the British, and so forth and so on. So we decided to do it through routine channels in all cases.
You, in your account of the meeting with Malraux, you describe a dream that Lincoln had and related it to your going to China.
Yes, this dream of Lincoln's is one that most biographers have carried, and I think therefore it is probably on the mark, although much of the stories about any great man like Lincoln are apocryphal. In this case, it was supposed to be a dream that he had, that he recounted to his cabinet the day before he was shot. And Lincoln often had dreams before great events. And he said this was a dream that he had had before Gettysburg, he'd had it before another great victory and so forth. And he said that, and it was repeated that night, and it went something like this, that he was on a singular, indescribable vessel moving with great rapidity. toward a distant, indistinguishable shore. And I repeated that to Malraux, and Malraux said, well, that is very interesting. And he said, as far as Mao is concerned, his shore is death. He said, and as far as you are concerned, you must avoid the shoals on either side. So that was some of the conversation.
Did you regret that de Gaulle, who would have been able to understand the enormity of of what you were doing, wasn't alive to see the opening to China?
Yes. Yeah, and may I say an Adenauer as well, because Adenauer and de Gaulle independently, anti-communists though both were sophisticated enough and geopoliticians enough to understand why it was necessary, something which it's very difficult for some of our good and hard-line superhawks who see the whole world in black and white and think that the only way that you're going to deal with communism is to isolate it and collapse it. Well, I wish that were the case, but it is not going to happen that way. Peaceful change is the only thing we can hope for, and that's what we must always work for. We must never accept the division of the world as it is. They don't, and we shouldn't either.
How did Malraux take his leave that night?
Well, it was a rather moving scene. I escorted him to the North Portico, and his car came up. And he said, as he said goodbye, he said, I am not de Gaulle. He said, nobody is de Gaulle. But if de Gaulle were here, he would wish you well on your mission. He would salute you for what you were doing.
What were your thoughts as as Air Force One first came over the Chinese mainland, and you, for better or for worse, you were there, you had done it?
Well, I am not one of those that is given to try to develop profound historic thoughts because of some new adventure.
Did you see it as an adventure?
No, I saw it in a different way, not as an adventure, which trivializes a very important event. I knew it was a very important event historically. I knew it was a very important event from the standpoint of the interests of the United States, the interests of building a more peaceful world for our children and grandchildren primarily, rather than just for ourselves. Also, however, I knew it was an adventure just as many other Americans did because China was an unknown land. I'd read about it all my life. It was a land of mystery, and the fact that we hadn't had communication with them for 25 years built up that mystery. And I remember Mrs. Nixon and I, as we were sitting in the plane looking down on this huge expanse of tiny farms and so forth and so on, we had a feeling about it that we had never had before. We had been already to 70 countries together, and I was to go to many more. I'm now over 90 in a number of countries. And there was nothing like going into other countries that we experienced here going into China, because it was new, because it was exciting, and because it was very, very important. For example, we had been to Moscow in 1959. That was a very important visit, and coming to Moscow on that trip was a time of excitement, but nothing compared to what we felt as we went into China. We knew that we were at a watershed event in human history.
We have some film of your arrival at Peking and your first meeting with Zhou Enlai. In fact, all we've got now is this still. Can you describe what was going on there?
Yes, I think that event was one that symbolized the trip more dramatically than anything else. As you note, I'm shaking hands with him, and that's not unusual because you always shake hands when you step off the plane with whoever is receiving you. I recall, incidentally, as I came down the steps before I shook hands, however, that he was clapping as I came down the steps. And I, of course, returned the clapping because I had learned that long before visiting other communist countries. They always respond. Whenever you clap, they clap at the same time. And so as we shook hands, it had particular symbolism because I knew from the briefing papers that Zhou Enlai was very sensitive about the fact that in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, that Foster Dulles had refused to shake hands with him. He told an amusing anecdote about that. Told me about the fact that Beadle Smith, who was
Zhou Enlai told you.
yeah, Zhou Enlai did. He told me an amusing anecdote about that. He said Beadle Smith, who was there with Dulles, that he said he wouldn't shake hands either, but what he did was that he held a coffee cup in his right hand and then gave him his sleeve on his left hand, and he had to shake hands that way. He was rather amused by it at that time. So he considered that to be a very important handshake. And I remember as we drove into the guest house through Peking, he said that handshake was over the vastest distance in the world, 25 years of no communication, which was a dramatic way of putting it. Now, incidentally, let me say, however, that if some of those, and they are legion, who believe that Foster Dulles was much too tough at that time, just so that they don't get the wrong idea, I well understand why Dulles didn't shake hands. It was a different time. We have to remember in 1954, that was only shortly after Chinese troops had killed over 50,000 Americans in Korea. It was at a time when communist China was an expansionist policy. They were intervening through their supporting guerrilla activities in the Philippines, in Malaysia, in Thailand, Singapore. And so under the circumstances, there was plenty of reason for Dulles not to be buddy-buddy with somebody who was a proclaimed enemy, not by what he said, but by what they were doing against our interest. But the situation had changed now. China, at the time that we made this trip, was no longer in an expansionary phase. They were supporting the Vietnamese, but not nearly as much as the Russians, who had taken over there as the main supplier of arms to the Vietnamese. They were primarily, at this time, at the time we went there, concerned about their own security, their strategic security, and of course, the possibilities for progress within the country. So under the circumstances, I thought it was proper that we should begin with a handshake.
We have a film also of your reviewing the honor guard at the airport in Peking with Zhou Enlai. This is another case where it's just a still, if you can comment on it. There you see Mao was a member of the honor guard. There we are. And that, in fact, is film.
The interesting thing to note about that guard is the size of the men. Zhou Enlai, who had a great attention to detail, despite the fact that he's one of the busiest men in the world, head of government of the most populous country in the world, personally picked people for an honor guard of that sort, as I later learned. As you will note, Chinese are supposed to be not as tall as we are, but most of those people were all of them, I think, were over 6 feet tall. And they were magnificently trained. I remember that, as you note, the reviewing officer looks each one in the eye. And in their case, instead of looking straight forward, as most do in other countries, their eyes followed me as we went around. And so there was a feeling of motion that was almost hypnotic as we went down the line.
Did he choose tall people and have this hypnotic sense to impress you with the strength of the Chinese armed forces?
No, he didn't do that. I don't think the guard was one that was just for me. I think that was their regular honor guard. But honor guards generally are, except in this country where we have honor guards with multicolored uniforms and so forth, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, all mixed in, which is ridiculous, incidentally.
Why?
Well, because it's not nearly as impressive as having one uniform. I much prefer it. And you should have an honor guard uniform.
Does an honor guard make an impression that makes any difference to a visiting head of state?
I think it does. I think it particularly makes an impression on heads of state from smaller countries. After all, they expect to be treated with great respect, and An honor guard is part of the drill. It's more important than the quarters you stay in. The proper honor guard, the guns that go off, the national anthems and so forth. I must say, to me, as impressive anything there was not so much the honor guard, but to hear the Chinese band play the Star-Spangled Banner, and to play it well. The Star-Spangled Banner is a difficult song to play, and boy, we have heard it mangled in some countries beyond belief. You could hardly recognize it. But the Chinese, curiously enough, musically, are fairly close to us. They seem to understand it, and they played it beautifully, just as they played American the Beautiful, the same Army band at the state dinner that they gave in the Great Hall of the People. They played it perfectly.
What goes through your mind as you're standing there at an airport arrival ceremony and the anthem is played? Are you thinking about what you're going to do next or say next, or does it actually have an emotional impact or a psychological impact to hear your anthem played in a foreign country?
Well, I suppose this sounds a little corny, but I can hardly recall a time, either in a foreign country or on the great ceremonies in the South Lawn of the White House, when standing there at attention, hearing the anthem played, the flags furled and so forth, where a little chill doesn't go up your back. It always has that effect on me.
We have some film from Peking television of your first meeting with Chairman Mao. How did you get word that you were going to be summoned to his presence?
Well, we didn't know that we would see him at all. In fact, when they made out the schedule, there was no indication that we were to have an appointment with him. We had heard that he had not been well, and all inquiries that were made, that Henry had made previously, were to the effect that no decision had been made as to whether or not we would see him. And so we arrived in the guest house and wondering whether we were going to see him, and because some people thought, some of those who were covering the trip, the press has already begun to speculate that Mao might snub us by not receiving us, which would have been quite a snub because he had received Haile Selassie and people of that sort. But that wasn't the way it happened. I was actually had taken off my clothes and was sitting in my shorts prior to going in and taking a shower when Henry came in, again rather breathless, and said, "Mao wants to see you right away." So we rushed down and got into the cars and went over to his residence in Peking. I remember the usual Chinese entrance, a gateway, sort of red was the color I recall, which of course is quite appropriate.
What were your first impressions on meeting him?
Well, he said he didn't talk very well, and some said the Chinese indicated that was because he had laryngitis, because it was obvious, however, that he'd had some sort of a stroke. But he talked well enough. He could be understood.
In
well
these
enough.
Pictures, he looks fairly voluble and vigorous.
Well understood. Sometimes the words didn't tumble out as well as they might. I would like to have known him when he was much better. But compared to what he was in 1976 when he had another stroke and when he talked so poorly then that he just couldn't get the words out. And I remember how painful it was even to watch him when he couldn't get words out. He'd get one of the girl secretaries standing in back of him, taking down every word that he said, and he'd grab the notepad and then he'd write out what he was trying to say and hand it back to her. And then she'd translate it. He'd hear the translation, it'd be wrong, and he'd say no, and grab it again and write it out. But this time, no problem like that. We had a very easygoing conversation. One thing that impressed me about his room was that it was very similar to that of Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion, the founder of the Israeli state, had a room just cluttered with all sorts of books open here and there and on the desk and so forth and so on. You know, you hear these days that the mark of a great executive or a good executive is a clean desk. That's not true. That if you have a clean desk, you usually have an empty head. And in this case, the Mao's room was a clutter of books. He obviously was a man who did a great deal of reading. As indicated too, he'd read my book, Six Crises, which Zhou Enlai had translated into Chinese before even it was agreed I'd make the visit. Some way or other, I think what appealed to them in that book is it was about struggle. And struggle, of course, is the theme that Mao and the Chinese communists constantly emphasized at that period.
Could you tell anything about from the relationship between the two, between Mao and Zhou Enlai, about the division of labor between them in terms of running China?
Well, there was no question that Zhou Enlai ran China. There was no question, however, that Mao was still chairman of the board, but he was not the chief executive officer in terms of carrying out things. But Zhou Enlai was very deferential to Mao, deferential because every word that Mao uttered was gospel. And I noted, for example, that after that first meeting with Mao, that Zhou Enlai would often quote Mao as to what he'd said in that first meeting. But Mao made the point very clearly when he said, look, I'm not here to discuss the details. That's for the prime minister to discuss. He said, I am here to talk about philosophy, general philosophy. And then he proceeded to do that.
Were they friends, do you think?
Yes. I do not think close friends. I don't think there was a great deal of affection there. There was respect on both parts. Each needed the other. I think that's the way that it worked.
How well prepped on you were they?
Oh, quite well. They, for example, had read what I had written. Example is that I had made a speech, for example, in Kansas City, which should have told the American press what to expect, and it got, I think, just minimal coverage in the American press. I don't think television covered it at all to speak of. But when Henry Kissinger saw Zhou Enlai had that speech, which had been covered in the Chinese press, in front of him there, and asked Henry whether he had seen it. Henry had not seen it because it was not one that was been prepared by the State Department or by the NSC. It was one that I had prepared by myself. And so he gave him a copy of it. Zhou Enlai gave Henry Kissinger a copy of the speech I had made in Kansas City that the American press had paid no attention to, but which indicated very clearly that we were going forward on some sort of a Chinese initiative. So it does show you they paid attention to what we were saying and doing.
Weren't they even aware of your taste in films?
Yes, they've done their homework because first they had a movie theater where they said we could see anything we wanted to see, that is, of films and of their films. But Henry told me that Zhou Enlai had read or heard that I had enjoyed the movie Patton, and so he had it produced and shown for him. Of course, he understood English, so it was understood a lot of English, a lot more than he ever let on. He never spoke in English, however.
What do you think Zhou Enlai learned about you from having watched Patton?
Oh, nothing particularly. The Patton movie was interesting to me not because of the war, but because of what it told us about the people. It's a fascinating study of Eisenhower, who never appears in person, of Bradley, of Montgomery, of Patton, and the rest. Just like Tolstoy's War and Peace, which is a great book, but I read it when I was in college, and my interest in it was not what it told about war and peace, but what it told about the characters that Tolstoy was a master at describing. I mean, the people seemed to walk on the pages.
Do you think that anybody who wants to understand you has to read Six Crises?
No, they don't have to really read anything. They can observe what I have done and judge for themselves. I do not believe that any individual, what he writes, should be the conclusive factor that determines how people are going to appraise him. After all, whatever anybody writes is through his own eyes and so forth. And what a person writes, I think, reveals very little.
Didn't Mao's writings, though, reveal a lot and have a great impact?
Not much about him. It revealed a lot about the Chinese Communist Revolution. I remember speaking to Mao about his writings, and I said the chairman's writings, and I spoke, the way it came about was that perhaps in reference to my own writings. I said, well, the chairman's writings are very important. And he said, in a self-deprecating way, he was always speaking in self-deprecating ways. Anybody who does not have an inferiority complex usually can speak in a self-deprecating way. And he said, well, I never wrote anything that was worth much. And I went on to say, but what the chairman wrote changed China and changed the world. He said, with a smile, he said, well, I haven't been able to change anything except a few places around Peking.
In your book Leaders, you write of Mao that, and your impressions of him, that his willpower somehow seemed a physical characteristic. How did you form that impression?
Mao is one who has great animal magnetism. That's something you would not ascribe incidentally to Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai was subtle, sophisticated, suave, smooth, cerebral. Mao was emotional, physical. Something very difficult to describe, but it's there, you can sense it. Khrushchev was the same way, incidentally. He also was a very physical presence. I'd say the same thing for Lyndon Johnson. I wouldn't say that about Kennedy, for example. That's the differences between various people.
Do you think Mao Zedong had problems justifying to his own people dealing with a right-wing anti-communist from the United States of America?
Oh, certainly. But he was not a bit defensive upon it. I remember when we were talking with his usual twinkle in his eye, he said, I voted for you in your last election. I assumed that he meant by that he favored me over Senator Humphrey, or Vice President Humphrey. But then he went on to say that, he said, you know, I like rightists, right-wingers. He said, I am always comfortable when the right comes to power. And he was referring to the Germans, to Heath in England and so forth. And
Did he mean this, or was he being humorous?
No, I think he meant it. I think he found that the right was more dependent. Let us understand how Mao's mind worked and how Zhou Enlai's mind worked. Let me start again. Let's understand how Mao and Zhou Enlai looked at China in 1972, at the time this new relationship with the United States took place. Why is it that Mao was to say that he liked right-wing governments? Because right-wing governments were the very antithesis of what he stood for. And the answer is that as far as the Chinese are concerned, their primary interest is China, always China. That's number one. Their secondary interest is philosophy. It doesn't mean that Mao Zedong was not a very dedicated Marxist communist, call him what you want. And the same is true of Zhou Enlai. But where there is conflict between the ideology and their security comes first. And so as far as they were concerned, in Iran, they liked the Shah of Iran, even though he was anti-communist. And they did not support the Tudeh party, which was the communist party in Iran. And as far as we were concerned, we were their ideological enemy. But on the other hand, as far as the security of China was concerned, we were absolutely indispensable to that security. And so as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, the Soviet Union was Marxist, communist, call it what you will. So was China. But the Soviet Union threatened China's security. And so every time you look at the Chinese, you've got to think of them in those terms. They're going to be thinking of China. What is going to be good for China? And if a right-wing regime is going to be more in their interest than a left-wing regime, they'll just put the left-wing regime right down the shaft.
On that point, we are going to break for a Chinese meal.
All right? when he was talking about liking rightists, Mao, in that self-deprecating way of his, said, you know, he said, sometimes I think that people like me sound like big empty cannons. We talk about overthrowing everybody. We will overthrow the imperialists, and we'll overthrow the revisionists, and we'll overthrow the capitalists. He said, after all, if we overthrow everybody, we're not going to have any friends left. So sometimes we have to get along with the rightists, and that, of course, he meant us.
You've described in your memoirs and in Leaders the differences between Mao and Zhou Enlai. What were the main differences that you noticed between the two men?
Well, Mao, I would say first, was fundamentally, well, let's start again. I don't want to give the answer to the question. Well, Mao basically was a physical creature. I say that in not a condescending way or a condemnatory way, but in terms of simply appraising him for what he was. He was more emotion, whereas Zhou Enlai was more intellectual, more brain. That doesn't mean that Mao was not a fairly learned man. After all, he wrote great poetry, at least great poetry from the standpoint of the Chinese and the revolutionary forces, and also read a great deal. But he primarily was one who approached problems in an emotional way. He appealed to the heart. Zhou Enlai, however, appealed to the head. I think that was the fundamental difference between their approaches. The second thing is that Zhou Enlai was a highly sophisticated, highly civilized person. Mao, on the other hand, was just what he was, a former peasant, very earthy, very down to earth. Zhou Enlai was, however, we must have in mind, not because he was simply a civilized person, a weak person. I remember Walter Robertson, the former Assistant Secretary of State during the Eisenhower years, telling me once about a story that he'd heard about Zhou Enlai, that Zhou Enlai was absolutely ruthless, that one time he came out of a room in which he had just killed one of his rivals, calmly smoking a cigarette. And there's no question that Zhou Enlai, along with Mao, are responsible for the killing or starving to death of millions of Chinese. So under the circumstances, therefore, we're not dealing here with a great humanist, even though he had humanist and humanitarian appearance. Having said all that, though, I would now come to a general appraisal of Zhou Enlai. Many times, I guess more often than not, people ask me, who was the greatest man you ever met? And here in answering the question, if the question is who was the best person, that's one thing. Who was the best president, the best king, the best leader, that's something else. Who was the indispensable man? Churchill was indispensable, for example, for Britain at the time of World War II. De Gaulle was indispensable for France during the period that he served. And Adenauer was indispensable for Germany. Yoshida was indispensable in creating modern Japan. In terms of comparison with these others, we would not say that Zhou Enlai was indispensable to the Chinese Revolution. Maybe Mao could have done it with somebody else, although Zhou was very effective. But I would say in terms of rating and comparing Zhou Enlai with the other world leaders that I have met, there was one area that he was without question number one. He was the greatest diplomat I've ever met. He was suave, poised, he had enormous stamina, he was always prepared, he was very tough when necessary, appeared to be conciliatory when necessary, always appeared to be reasonable, but never gave in on anything he possibly could, where he thought that giving in would not serve his interests. I think perhaps the phrase that best describes him is one that Churchill used in describing Parnell, the great Irish patriot of the 19th century. He said that he was a volcano under an ice cap. And I think that this probably describes Zhou Enlai. Beneath, there was a volcano, but on top it was an ice cap. And that made him the effective diplomat that he was.
How can you talk with such admiring objectivity about a man who had the blood of several millions of people on his hands?
Oh, I'm admiring him for his capabilities as a diplomat, for his capabilities as a leader at the time that I dealt with him. I'm not admiring him in terms of his past record. That is something else again, just as I'm sure he didn't admire, for example, the United States for what he considered to be our capitalist exploitation of the masses. I totally disagree with his appraisal of our system and what we have done, and certainly he disagrees with my appraisal.
Should the United States deal with regimes or leaders whose policies include internal murder? Should, say if Hitler had wanted to reach some kind of a sensible understanding in terms of U.S. interests with Franklin Roosevelt, should he have treated with Hitler, regardless of the internal arrangements?
Well, there didn't seem to be any possibility that would happen at that time, but I think Churchill, just turning the subject around, put it fairly well in context when he was criticized in the House of Commons for making common cause with communist Russia after Hitler invaded Russia. And I think Churchill said something to the effect that, let's see, what was it?
That he would make a pact with the devil.
No, let's see. I think I'm going to miss that one there. Where Churchill defended his making common cause with Stalin, even though he had previously been intensely critical of him, putting Stalin and Hitler in exactly the same boat, and after the war, incidentally, he continued to criticize him. But at that particular time, when Hitler was the major enemy, he made common cause with him.
How did you, or how do you answer your critics at the time, particularly your conservative critics, who said that by going to China, you legitimized this brutal anti-American regime, and that in fact their policies hadn't changed, that the masses of murders that had occurred in the 40s and 50s and the Cultural Revolution were perhaps past, but that they still have a brutal, murderous, oppressive regime there?
Well, the Russians haven't changed. The Chinese haven't changed. Eastern Europeans haven't changed, except moderately in terms of their treatment of their own people. And over a period of time, however, change possibly may take place. What I am simply suggesting here, that clearly apart from whether they have changed or not, looking at the fundamental responsibility of a president of the United States, responsible for the security of this country, failing to have a rapprochement with the People's Republic of China at that time would have been inexcusable and unacceptable, because frankly we needed them just as much as they needed us. And if we didn't have that rapprochement today, I repeat, we would be in an impossible position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. You take the Soviet Union, you add the billion people that are in China with its enormous resources, and the whole balance of power in the world tips irreparably against us. And that is what we are helping to prevent.
What does it feel like to sit across the table from a man who had killed someone with his bare hands and walked out of the room smoking a cigarette? Does it occur to you that he could do it to you under similar circumstances?
I don't think of that, and I doubt if he thought of me in terms of the way he had heard me described as the capitalist devil. We were both pragmatic. We both had other things to think about that we thought of higher priority than what had happened in the past. And that's the way we approached it.
Is this attitude towards these leaders and regimes an exception to your conservatism?
No. No, I would say that in the whole foreign policy area, that I believe what it is most important is that it be an effective foreign policy and one that will always put emphasis on our primary responsibility, and that is to have our system survive. It must survive because the United States, whatever our faults may be, is the hope of the world. We are the main force that deters the only major nation that threatens war or defeating other nations without war, and we are the nation that will certainly defend freedom wherever we possibly can when it's within our capabilities.
But if we compromise our principles, doesn't that make our survival not worthwhile, or the same nation isn't surviving? Don't you have to stand up at a certain point and be willing to die for what you believe in?
As a matter of fact, war compromises principles. War is evil. All war is wrong. All killing is wrong. The question is, for example, when Eisenhower ordered the bombing of Dresden, which was a civilian target, and 40 million Germans burned to death in one night, that certainly was immoral, but it would have been more immoral to allow Hitler rule Europe. That's what it gets down to.
What was Zhou Enlai's health like in your observations of him?
I had heard that. Yeah, we'll repeat that. No, I'll just.
That's
I'll
a
just
long
repeat
question.
that.
Yeah,
No. I'll cover it.
Pick up Eisenhower's decision.
Mm-hmm. Ready? Well, you take Eisenhower's decision for the bombing of Dresden in World War II. It was a civilian target. And the firebombing of Dresden cost 40,000 German lives in one night. Now, that was immoral, but it would have been more immoral to allow Hitler to rule Europe. And those are decisions that leaders have to make, and sometimes they are terribly difficult. That was a difficult one for Eisenhower, as he often told me thereafter.
What was Zhou Enlai's health like in your observation of him on this trip?
Well, his stamina was unbelievable. We'd have these long meetings. You see, every meeting is twice as long as it would normally be because while he understood English and quite a bit of it, he never spoke in it, so you had to have the translation. And we'd go on for 2 or 3 hours in the morning and 3 or 4 hours in an afternoon. And then he would spend half the night working with Kissinger on the details of memoranda and so forth and agreements that we had discussed earlier in the day.
When did he sleep?
He slept apparently after midnight. I talked to Miss Tang, who was one of the translators, Brooklyn-born, brilliant, and she said that he got along with 4 to 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours a day. I noticed on occasion he took a little white pill during the day. I don't know what it was. And of course, as we know later on, he died with what was diagnosed as either cancer or a form of cancer, leukemia. But his stamina, as I said, was unbelievable. A couple of things indicated to me that he was not as good health as he was. At the big state dinner when we were toasting each other in Mao Tai, which is the fiery Chinese brew, which he proved how fiery it was by pouring a bit into a saucer and lighting a match to it, and it practically exploded. He told me one amusing story, too, that it was so strong it's been known that when one fellow had drunk too much Mao Tai, he lit a cigarette, he blew up. And so as he was talking about Mao Tai, he said that during the long march, he had on occasion had as many as 24 cups. That's a small cup, about 24 ounces in one day. He said, now, I limit myself to 2 or 3 ounces.
What does it taste like?
It's just like wood alcohol. It's a fiery brew.
How did you handle it during the
I just sipped it.
toasts going around?
As a matter of fact, you can practically get drunk smelling it. And what happened was the custom is Chinese style that after you propose a toast, you go around the entire table of 20 or 30 of the honored guests and tip with each one. You hold up your glass, look them in the eye, next one. And I went around and so did he. And I noted when each of us had finished our round of 24 drinks, we still had half a glass left. That's how we stayed sober for the talks that were to take place later that night.
Andre Malraux had told you that the Chinese would be struck by the age of your party. Was that, did that turn out to be the case?
Age constantly came into it. I know that Zhou Enlai one time, to my surprise, said how impressed he was by our advance team, and they were an excellent team. They did a marvelous job of advancing. Dwight Chapin was one of them, and he was only 33 at the time. I thought that was young. But Zhou Enlai also mentioned Marshall Green, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, and Marshall Green was 51. but he thought he was young too. But you see, Zhou Enlai was 73 at that time and still had the vigor of somebody of 23. He was a man of enormous physical vigor and mental discipline. Another thing that Zhou Enlai impressed me with was his attention to detail. You know, usually we say leaders shouldn't pay much attention to detail, and sometimes many of us get too immersed in detail. But I recall, for example, that he checked over every item on the menu at the state dinner to be sure that it had been prepared exactly the right way. And I understand the reason he did that was he was a very good chef himself. I pointed out to him that Eisenhower had also been very proud of his cooking ability, which pleased him a great deal. Another incident that proved that, Bill Rogers is telling me that on one occasion when he was having a meeting with Zhou Enlai, they brought in the Daily World, or whatever it was called, the Chinese Communist daily newspaper, and which was to come out the next day. And he personally edited it while he was talking to Rogers about some of the other matters that we had to discuss at that time. And I recall particularly when the day we went to the Great Wall, it had been snowing, and we were attending an event in the gymnasium, a big gymnastic event. And I noticed that about halfway through the event that Zhou Enlai got up and left, and I just assumed, well, he's 73 years old, he probably had to go to the men's room. That wasn't it at all. As a matter of fact, he came back, and what he had done, he went out personally to check to see whether the people he had ordered to go out to sweep all of the roads clear of snow had done so that the roads would be clear when we went to the Great Wall, and they were pristine clear. How he did all those things, and yet saw the forest and not just the trees in our conversations, was a very remarkable achievement. I can understand why one of the major Taiwan leaders, the government there, said rather wistfully after they had lost China, he said, if we had had Zhou Enlai on our side, we would have won.
We have a picture from that gymnastic exhibition, which I think you, in your diary of the China trip, you commented what a tremendous impact and impression this site made on you.
Yes, I recall the event very well, and I also recall, as I look at that picture, what I heard when I was in Pakistan in 1965 from Ayub Khan. He was a strong anti-communist. He had just come home from Peking because he'd become disillusioned by the administration, the Johnson administration's treatment of them leaning too much to India and the rest, and was turning toward China himself. And I said, what was your impression of it? He said, primarily people. Millions and millions of people, the enormous potential strength of it. And there, in that picture, as we were there that night, I saw these people, but what impressed me more than the fact that they were young and vigorous, which they were, was that they were so totally disciplined. And I could see what an enormous force that would be under the control of any leader who was opposed to us. And why it was therefore important to attempt to influence that force in a way that would not be against our interest. Nothing brought home to me more vividly than that night, seeing that demonstration of not only vigor but also of discipline, the vital necessity of not only beginning the China Initiative but nurturing it from there on out.
Do you think American youth has vigor and discipline today?
A lot of it has. Let me say, let's not be unimpressed, even though I know that most of our elitists in the educational community would not approve of what I'm just going to say. Let us not be unimpressed with some of the bans and other things that we see at football games and the rest. No, our young people are capable of discipline. And we wouldn't want them to be like the Chinese people. We wouldn't want them to be like Hitler's youth. We want them to have individuality. But it is also important for them to bear in mind that in order to keep the freedom which allows the diversity of individuality, it's necessary sometimes to be totally disciplined and to give up some freedom in order to keep all freedom for the future.
During your time in Peking, you got to sit next to one of the great charmers in the history of the world, Mao's wife. What were your impressions of her?
Well, frankly, of course, she was not in her prime when I saw her, but I rather wondered why he had married her. But it was his fourth wife, and I understand, according to some, probably unfriendly critics of Mao, that she seduced him from his third wife. Whatever the case might be, she was very, very intense. What I remember most about her that night was that she was sweating. The sweat was pouring down from her head and so forth. And I sort of wondered what was the matter, and she apologetically said that she'd been having some influenza. But I think it was tension. And as distinguished from the grace of Zhou Enlai and the warm hospitality of Mao, despite the fact that I knew that ideologically we were total enemies, she was one that made no bones about the fact that she didn't like us. I remember she turned to me in the middle of one of the performances and said, "Why did you wait so long to come to China? Why didn't you come before?" And I just ignored it and just kept looking at the performance. She was also interested. It showed at least that she had followed what had happened in America. She was interested in what happened to Jack London. Some way that had appealed to her. She said, "What did he die of?" And I, not being a London expert, I guessed pretty good. I said, "I think it was alcoholism." She asked about Walter Lippmann, who's incidentally, she had read some of his columns in the Christian Science Monitor, which shows that some of the papers are distributed there. And I made a point which I hoped got back to Mao. I assumed that it did, assuming she was still on speaking terms with him, which I can't be sure of. But I said, well, he's over 80, but I talked to him on the phone recently, and I had on his 80th birthday, and that he's still very sharp. And so much for that.
Was she the only leading, powerful woman you met in China?
On that trip, yes. Although I would say this, I did meet Zhou's wife, Zhou Enlai's wife, and she was a gracious, charming, sophisticated woman. Although in her own right, as I learned when I saw her in '76 and paid a courtesy call on her, Zhou Enlai had died just before I got there in '76. In her own right, she was a Communist Party leader. But she was more Chinese in meeting her guests, as the case might be. But generally speaking, I remember many, many years ago, during a time of the Hiss case, when we were questioning Alger Hiss and then his wife Priscilla Hiss, that Chambers made an interesting observation. He said, when you meet a communist couple, generally you will find that the woman is the red hot of the two. And I have generally found that that's true not just of communism, but of politics generally. Women are less compromising, they're more idealist, more ideological, and they're more intense, they're less forgiving, and certainly she fit that right to a T. I compared her in my mind's eye, too, with the other great Chinese woman who was the wife, I compare her with another woman who was the wife of a great Chinese leader, Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she's a Wellesley graduate, highly sophisticated, gracious, charming, and very tough and very intelligent in standing up for the views that she believed in and in representing her husband around the world. They were two very different people. But one, Mao's wife, was frankly one that simply turned me off because of her attitude, not just for what she stood for. She just didn't have any grace. Zhou Enlai had grace. And Mao, in his own way, had some charm. But this woman, nothing.
Do you count it as among the worst offenses of the Chinese Revolution that it suppressed the beauty of some of the world's most beautiful women?
I think it was a great mistake, and I think they're going to have to rectify it and already are. In some of the books that I read before I went there, old China hands, those that presume to be experts, and I don't think anybody's an expert, the more you know about China, the less you know about China. It will always be that way. But in any event, they wrote to the effect that the Chinese communists were trying, of course, to make a new man in China, but they were also trying to put the women into that same category. And it was very difficult because women traditionally in China have played a very interesting role. Oh, it's subordinate in a way, but also independent in a way. You see Chinese women in the great cities like Hong Kong, Manila, etc., and they have the grace, the charm, the beauty. They're some of the great beauties of the world. The Chinese. They love color, and when you go to China, and particularly in 1972, I didn't see any color at all. The women translators were dressed in these Mao suits, big baggy pants, and so forth. They looked just like the men, the short-cut hair, no style, no makeup. And then it subtly began to change. By 1976, just a tiny bit of color would show out under the Mao coat or jacket on the dress beneath. And curiously enough, not that this is terribly important, but it does show you they had to compromise some. When I went there in 1982, they still had women translators, but they were dressed, believe it or not, in very, very beautifully tailored slack suits, beautifully colored, and in the evening they wore nice dresses. I asked one of them where they got it, and she blushed a little. She says, "I got it when I was in Hong Kong." Although the Chinese themselves are very good at fabrics, as we're learning with having to compete with them.
How significant is something like that? Can the length of a hemline or a piece of blouse beneath a cuff indicate major social change?
Only if you put it in its total context and its proper context. What it does indicate that the Chinese communists found that it was impossible to force their system, impersonalizing everybody, equalizing everybody on the mass of the Chinese people. It just isn't working. So subtle changes are taking place. How significant they are remains to be seen. It's the same thing with regard to such as the fact that now, compared with 1972, in 1972, as you went along the streets of Peking and the other cities, everybody was walking. Hundreds of thousands walking, or I should say shuffling. By 1982, most of them were on bicycles and a few cars and so forth. In 1972, no TV. 1982, several million sets of TV, and importing some, and exporting, I should say, some sets in Southeast Asia, which they proudly told me then. What does this mean? Part of it is material progress, and that can happen in a communist country as well as any other, but in terms of allowing more diversity, more freedom, even in such things as clothes, that must tell us something as well.
On the principle that it's hard to keep people down on the collective farm after they've seen Paris, does this kind of liberalization, will it present a problem to the communist leadership? Can you give an inch and not have people take a mile when you're giving them this kind of freedom and diversity?
That's the problem they have. It's the great dilemma. It's a great dilemma in a broader sense. Let's put it in its economic context. In 1972, I remember some of the fatuous suggestions to the effect that I saw it in one column in particular that I won't quote for the moment as far as to who wrote it, but I remember it so vividly. He said, when President Nixon goes to China, the first question that Mao Zedong is probably going to ask him is, will the world's richest nation help the world's most populous nations, and how can it help it? Well, that, of course, misinterpreted why they came to a rapprochement with us and why we went there. It did not have at that time anything to do with economics. And the Chinese didn't raise economic questions whatever with us. We had to raise it with them in terms of economic cooperation. That was 1972. But now it's changed a great deal. China is still concerned about its survival. And that requires that the United States be strong enough and have the will to deter Soviet aggression and Soviet threats against them or anybody else. That's on the survival side. But China also is concerned about progress. It's a terribly poor country. In order to have progress, they need more diversity. They need more freedom. They need more private enterprise. For example, you mentioned collective farms. The only agriculture that is productive in China today are on small plots that are being given to the peasants to run on their own where they can make a profit. In some of the cities, you will find privately owned and privately operated groups and so forth and so on. The problem the Chinese have with this, however, is that if they are going to have more progress, they've got to have more freedom. In order to keep power, they have to have less. Because the moment you set up private plots, privately owned concerns, more freedom and diversity for people and so forth, the more you set up the potential power centers that will not continue to accept the domination of a one-party state.
Did you meet Marshal Ye, the military leader on this trip?
No, on my last trip in 1982, I asked to meet him, but he was not well. And shortly thereafter, he resigned his top position. But I have vivid memories of him in 1972 because he was the one who accompanied me on the trip to the Great Wall. He was a perfectly delightful man, knew some English, was one of Mao's associates in the Long March, and was particularly interested, I recall vividly, in what we were doing about cancer. I didn't know why he was asking that question, and it seemed to me rather ironic. It was cancer that killed Mao later.
Zhou Enlai.
No, it's cancer that killed Zhou Enlai later. And I would say that one of the benefits of our relationship, or I would say, I think that one of the most useful things we've had, and we did set up, out of that summit, we did set up a joint cancer research activity between the two countries. Because who knows, we think we're so smart in this country. We've got certainly the best medical care in the world, and we think the best doctors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if there is an answer to cancer, it may not be in the United States. Maybe it's somebody in China, might be somebody in Africa, might be somebody in Latin America. And my view is, let's share all of that wisdom in some way, find that one individual who will find that answer.
Did Mao and Zhou talk about Chiang Kai-shek, and how did they refer to him?
It was sort of a mixed reaction. I think as Chinese, they respected him. As communists, they hated him because he was their enemy. But they spoke to him with a considerable amount of respect. I remember Mao, in a rather interesting sidelight, he said, I noticed that our old friend Chiang Kai-shek does not like your coming here. He always calls us bandits. And I said, well, what does the chairman call Chiang Kai-shek? He says, oh, we call him bandits too sometimes. We abuse each other. But then he went on to say, but I should remind you that our friendship with him goes back much further than yours.
What do you think will happen in U.S.-Taiwan relations?
But the United States will and should continue to provide defensive weapons for Taiwan. But the level of assistance should be directly related to the offensive threat. That is what the Shanghai II communique, which settled, at least temporarily, this burning issue a few months ago, provides. On the Chinese side, looking at Peking, it is important then, if they want the level of arms to Taiwan reduced, they must reduce the threat. And the United States should continue to insist, as we did in the Shanghai Communique in 1972, and this also is the line in all other statements between the two countries, that the issue between Peking and Taipei be settled peacefully. I also should point this out, however. I have no concern about any danger that Peking is going to launch an amphibious war against Taiwan. They have the Russians to worry about. They'd be out of their minds to do that. The second point I should make is this, and this is something that our friends in Taiwan and some of the friends of Taiwan in the United States have overlooked. The greatest and the most indispensable, second point, and there's another point that should be made, and that is this is something that our friends in Taiwan and the friends of Taiwan in the United States have often overlooked, that the most indispensable factor in guaranteeing the security of Taiwan is a good relationship between the United States and Peking. If we have that relationship, that may restrain them. If Peking has a relationship like that with the Soviet Union, then Taiwan is in mortal danger. I do not see any solution working out in the near future, perhaps some sort of a Commonwealth status in which Taiwan retains its economic and social character, as Hong Kong, of course, must as well. Maybe that will happen. I'm not prepared to say. But at the present time, we should keep the issue where it is. Taiwan is in no danger. It will continue to have its own economic system and continue to prosper. And I think that as long as we do not provoke Peking by either our statements or our actions in providing more than is needed for defense to Taiwan, Peking, they'll huff and puff, but they will do nothing.
Do you think there's a danger that a Democratic or a liberal Republican president would withdraw our support from Taiwan, and what would the impact of that be?
Well, there is the danger, but it would be a very great mistake. Because if we in effect say to Peking, look here, we're withdrawing all our support, we're breaking our economic relations, which is what we really have at the present time primarily, and whatever military support that we're giving, it would simply encourage Peking to move on Taiwan, to move on it, recognizing that they would have no problem as far as we're concerned. No, that's not the thing to do. I don't think it's going to happen for that reason, even though some might be tempted to do it.
How do you evaluate the China relationship in the years since you left office?
Well, I think we have to look at it in the long view and then in the short view, too. In the long view, it has not accomplished as much as I would have hoped, but more than many expected. For example, 10 years ago, there was no trade between China and the United States. Last year, it was $5.5 billion. 10 years ago, there were no Chinese students studying in the United States. Last year, there were 12,000. 10 years ago, there were no American tourists in China. Last year, there were over 100,000. Now, that is some progress in those particular areas. In terms of the geopolitical relationship, the strategic relationship between the two, it's had its ups and downs. After all, Mao died, Zhou Enlai died. We've had new presidents in the United States. We've had Ford and then Carter and now Reagan. And consequently, you don't have the smooth road that you would normally expect under those circumstances. But I would say that as far as that relationship is concerned today, that while what brought us together, the Soviet threat, is really because of the fact that the Soviet Union now has at least parity with the United States overall in nuclear strength, while that threat is greater than it was 10 years ago, in terms of the Chinese mind, it could be slightly less, although that is something that I don't think anybody can judge at this point. So under the circumstances, I think it's important for us to recognize that in order to keep the Chinese-American rapprochement healthy, it is necessary to add to it another factor. It's a factor that's already there, but that is in a very, very minimal state of growth, and that is the economic factor. I don't think it makes any sense, for example, for the United States to have more liberal trading policies insofar as technology is concerned with India, which is more under Soviet control than Peking, to put it mildly, than we have with Peking. I think it's very important for us to expand dramatically, for us, the Japanese and the Europeans, our economic ties with the People's Republic of China, having in mind that the Chinese leadership will continue to look west if, one, they believe that the United States has the will and the power to help guarantee their survival. And two, from the positive standpoint, they will continue to look west if they feel that in order to have progress, it is better to turn west and everything that we can offer than to turn east toward the Russians. And so I think if we play it that way, the key is in our own hand as to whether the rapprochement will grow or whether it will wither and die, and they will turn toward the Russians.
Do you think that their fears of the Russians are justified? Do you think that the Russians would jump them if they had the chance and thought they could beat them?
The question is whether or not the Soviet leaders, looking as they usually do down the long haul rather than short term, whether they feel that they must neutralize China now when China is weaker, and particularly weaker in terms of nuclear capability, because right now the Soviet Union could have a successful first strike, preemptive strike against China, or whether they wait until China becomes a formidable force. My view is that the likelihood of their doing it is relatively small. But I think at times they might be tempted. But that brings us to another point. It's very important not to give them a provocation. Now, I know that some of our China watchers and Soviet watchers say, gee, wouldn't it be great if these two fought each other? And then we have the two great communist powers destroying each other. And the answer is it wouldn't be great at all. The answer is that if those two powers do fight, it will escalate into a world war. Also, putting it another way, if you allow tensions between Peking and Moscow to grow and develop and be exacerbated to the point that Moscow feels it has been provoked and has a right to attack China, then the question is, what do we do? Are we going to stand with them? Can we allow the whole geopolitical balance in the world to be changed by having the Soviet Union take over China?
Is that why a Sino-Soviet war would become a world war?
No, a Sino-Soviet war could become a world war for that reason, potentially, assuming that the United States would react, and I'm not suggesting they would or wouldn't. But it would for another reason. In the event that there's a Sino-Soviet war, it is bound to escalate into nuclear war, and I am convinced that nuclear war is not going to be contained whenever it happens.
In what way?
Well,
I mean, what other nuclear power would become involved?
When the nuclear genie gets out of the bottle, and those things start flying around, and with all these alarm systems going off and the rest, I just have no confidence at all it can ever be contained.
Are there any contacts now between the Soviets and the Chinese? Do you see the possibility of a rapprochement developing?
Yes. There's no question about the fact that there are contacts, and the Chinese always make it very clear to us that there are. They, at the same time, say they have no illusions about the difficulty of reaching a rapprochement. But we should not object to those contacts. If they can reduce the possibility of border incidents that might escalate into war or give the Soviet a provocation, we should welcome that. But when you look at the conditions the Chinese have laid down, the possibility that the Soviet will be able to satisfy them are remote, because the Chinese have said the Soviet have got to quit supporting Vietnam, and Vietnam is an enemy of China at the present time on its southern border, that they've got to get out of Afghanistan. Well, the Soviet Union can't get out of Afghanistan because that basically is a counter-revolution. They can't allow counter-revolution to succeed. The Chinese are concerned about the Soviet ties to India, because India on the south is more, there's certainly considerable Soviet influence, at least Soviet support for the Indian armed forces. And under the circumstances, they're concerned about that. And then they're concerned about 40 or 50 Soviet divisions on the northern border. Now, I do not see the Soviet Union taking action that will alleviate their concerns in these areas. And only if they take that kind of action are you going to have a total rapprochement. But let's have one other thing in mind. If the Chinese should give up on us, if they think we lack either the power to deter Soviet aggression or the will to do so in the event that it occurs, then they, because of their primary concern about China and its survival, will have no choice but to make a rapprochement with the Soviet. So the key is in our hand. In our hands, not only in that respect, but as I pointed out earlier, in terms of giving them a positive incentive not to turn toward the Russians. The positive incentives by saying, in effect, by more trade and contact between China and Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, that is the way they can have the economic progress which they desperately need in order to become a major economic power and a major military power.
Could we survive if the Soviets and the Chinese got back together again?
Oh, yes. I'm never one that says the United States can't survive even apart from the rest of the world, but it would be a much more dangerous world, a very dangerous world. And the other point of the matter, if the Chinese and the Russians got back together again, in what position does that put Japan? See, China is very close to Japan. Russia is very close to Japan. Japan is today and will be for the next 25 to 50 years the real big prize in Asia, much bigger than China, because Japan has a GNP equal to that of the Soviet Union today, and by the end of the century may have equaled that of the United States.
Does the American foreign policy establishment understand that?
I think so. I think that the American foreign policy establishment does not downgrade what Japan means. But let me say it's very important for us always to have in mind that with all of our interest in China, that Japan is the big prize. And we've constantly got to make it clear that we will work with the Japanese to provide the nuclear umbrella that they themselves, because of what they went through in World War II, will never provide on their own and shouldn't.
Is there a hotline between the Kremlin and the Forbidden City like there is between the Kremlin and the White House?
I don't know whether there is today. I must say that I was amused, now that you mention that, however, that in speaking of hotlines, that Joe and Lai told me of an amusing incident that occurred during the period in 1959 when relations between Peking and Moscow were getting very cool. And Kosygin tried to call Joe and Lai on the hotline phone.
67.
Is it 67?
Because 59 would have been still Khrushchev.
You're right. That's right. Okay. I recall, speaking of hotline, I recall an incident, a very amusing one that Joe and Lai told me about the hotline, supposedly, that existed between Peking and Moscow. And as we do, he referred to the hotline as a telephone line, which it isn't. It's really a telegraphic line. But nevertheless, he said that what happened was that Kosygin was trying to call Joe and Lai in 1967 on the phone, and the telephone operator said, I cannot connect you. And Kosygin said, why not? You're a revisionist, and I will not let him talk to a revisionist. And she hung up on him.
Why were the Chinese so concerned about secrecy? Why was it so vital to their approach?
They were concerned for two reasons. One, they were concerned about the internal objections to any rapprochement with a great capitalist country like the United States. After all, they had been taught since infancy about the fact that the United States was evil. Many of them had fought against the United States in Korea. Mao's son, one of his sons, was killed in Korea. And Mao, incidentally, after that happened, was very phlegmatic about it. He said, well, the personal things don't enter in. This was part of the struggle and so forth. But nevertheless, it's a fact. Now, here is this government making a rapprochement with the United States. That was one factor. The other, however, and I think this was the more overriding factor, they knew that if before it was signed, sealed, and